everyone, welcome back to a new post today. Today let's discuss what are the economic implications of the governments of India's decision with regard to amendments of two important laws which govern the nuclear energy in India. Now we know that India has the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2070. India is also updating its nationally determined contributions as well with regard to the Paris Convention, and India has goals to reduce carbon emissions, the carbon footprint, and it also wants to develop a carbon market as well called as the Indian carbon market. So one of the steps with regard to this direction is now the amendments to two laws with regard to nuclear energy. They govern nuclear energy. It also not only deals with India's environmental or green goals, but also wants to increase private participation with regard to generation of nuclear energy, and also wants to invite foreign companies and foreign countries with regard to nuclear energy in India. Let's take a brief look at what are these two laws and what do they intend to do, and economically what does this mean for the Indian market. Now, as I told you, India looks to expand its nuclear power and to meet the growing energy needs with regard to AI, data centers, and also digital India. India wants to make changes to two laws with regard to nuclear liability now, which remains a major hurdle. So the law holds both the operators and the suppliers, which is the only country in the world doing so, accountable for damages in case of a nuclear disaster, unlike the international framework, which only holds liable the operators and not the suppliers. Now, global collaborations with countries like France and America to attract the foreign investments in India's nuclear sector have been on hold just because of this small change in India's nuclear liability. The debate still continues about who will be responsible in case of a nuclear disaster and the compensation to the victims. Now, while India's nuclear liability law places primarily the responsibility on the operator, that is, the corporation that runs the nuclear installation, for example, Nuclear Power Corporation of India, it also includes the right to recourse against the supplier, which is the only country in the world to do so, and that too under certain conditions. So the government now aims to bring two amendments to make main laws governing nuclear energy in India, and the aim is to open the nuclear energy sector to private companies and to limit the liability of nuclear vendor from whom India purchases the equipment to a certain amount only, and that too within a limited time period. That means in case of a nuclear accident, the vendors, that is the persons who sell us the operators or the equipment, will not be totally responsible for the compensation that has to be given to the victims. So what are these two laws? They are Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010 and the Atomic Energy Act of 1962. The two amendments are expected to take care of the niggling legal bottlenecks that are seen to have stymied the foreign investments in the atomic energy sector. Now, with regard to the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act of 2010, it seeks to create a mechanism for compensating victims in case of a nuclear accident and allocating the liability procedures for compensation mainly to the operators and also the suppliers. Now, these have been cited as impediments by foreign players like GE Hitachi, Westinghouse, and also the French company Areva. This is primarily on the grounds that the legislation in India channelizes the operator's liability to equipment suppliers as well, with foreign vendors citing this as a reason for holding them back from investing in India's nuclear sector, fearing that they could incur a future liability in case of a nuclear accident. Now, the amendments to the Atomic Energy Act, apart from the Civil Liability Nuclear Damage Act of 2010, the second act, that is of the 1962, is being initiated to enable private companies to possibly, and also foreign country companies, companies at a later stage to enter into nuclear generation as operators. That means they can take up the role which is now being played by the Nuclear Power Corporation of India, which is a government PSU. Now currently this is just restricted to the government owned companies like NTPC, National Thermal Power Corporation, and NPCIL, that's the National Power Corporation, Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited. So the aim of enacting these laws for nuclear liability is to ensure compensation to whom? The victims that have been affected by a disaster. Now, for example, like Fukushima, which took place in Japan. Now, there is a convention which governs this liability, which is called as a Convention on Supplementary Compensation. It was introduced to finalize a minimum national compensation amount. Now, if the amount is not sufficient for the survivors, it can be increased through public funds to cover the damage caused by nuclear accidents. Now, even though India was a signatory to the convention, the Parliament gave a formal consent to the treaty very late in 2016, and then in 2010 it also enacted the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act to ensure speedy compensation to the victims of a nuclear accident. According to this act, the operator of the nuclear plant is liable to cover damage through insurance or through other financial security of up to 1500 crore rupees. If the damage exceeds 1500, then the government comes into the picture. The government needs to step up to cover the extra cost of compensation. However, according to this law, the government's liability is capped at around 2300 crore. In addition, the act also sets a time limit for when the operator must provide the compensation. Now, the Indian law isn't restricted to operators, and this is the major problem, and that is why the government is bringing changes to these two acts in the coming monsoon session of the Parliament. It is to see how far the opposition members would support these amendments, because these were the same people who were in the government previously and actually opposed the amendments to the act. Now, it also allows them to take the compensation from the suppliers too in certain conditions according to the present law, and the act says that after paying their share of compensation, the operator shall have the right to recourse where the nuclear incident has resulted as a consequence of an act of supplier or his employee. Now, this includes substandard devices, defects in the supply of equipments, and more. The lawmakers included a supplier liability clause after recognizing the defective parts that were responsible for industrial disasters in the past, mainly the 1984 Bhopal gas tragedy that killed thousands and left lakhs of survivors with haunting scars. So what exactly is this now the supplier liability clause has been an issue. Many foreign as well as domestic suppliers, now they have an issue with the Indian liability law because it is the only country whose suppliers have been asked to pay for damages in the act, and they are concerned about getting exposed to unlimited liability under the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act. On the other hand, the international legal framework on nuclear liability says the compensation amount will only be borne by the operator and no other person. The governments and companies used to say that holding suppliers accountable for accidents can make their business unsustainable, and not only here but also in other countries, and also raise doubts by according to their credibility. Most of these countries placed responsibility solely on the operators. The government is committed now to get these two legislations passed with amendments and changes with explicit assurance to this effect made in the union budget earlier this year. It is to see how these two bills would be passed after the recent Operation Sindoor and its questions being raised by the opposition parties. So economically, once again, let's see what does this mean. It means more clean energy because now private sectors will be allowed to participate as operators, more energy for AI and data centers, so more clean nuclear energy for AI data centers and also digital India. Cheaper energy, to set the nuclear power will be cheaper than the conventional energy, achieving India's clean energy goals according to Paris Climate Change Agreement, achieving net zero emission targets by 2070 and developing a carbon market called as the Indian carbon market. So these are the most important points I thought I should be raising for you with regard to the two acts that are being amended and what is their economic significance. If you did, please do like, share and subscribe, and don't forget to comment at the end of the video. I shall see you tomorrow in another new post. Until then, it's very happy learning.